In 2021, a company making stationary exercise bikes and streaming fitness videos was somehow worth more than the Ford Motor Company. Let that sink in for a second. We're talking about a $50 billion valuation for a product that you basically peddle in your living room. And today, that same company is fighting this grueling battle just for its survival. Welcome back to The Strategy Show, the podcast that connects real world business events with the strategy concepts that help us understand them. I'm Ben Dixon Green, and today our mission is to explore the absolute strategic roller coaster of Peleton. Please drop me a follow and feel free to add a comment to let me know your thoughts on this show. What we're going to do in this episode is figure out how a company like Peleton manages to build a temporary advantage, lose it completely, and then scramble to try and build something sustainable. If you're studying business strategy or, you're just curious about how a spectacular corporate boom and bust works, then this episode is going to give you some perspective. We're going to examine Peleton's journey through the lens of established business strategy frameworks. So things like PESTLE, Porter's Five Forces, and the generic strategies. Because by applying these models, we can isolate the exact decisions that drove Peleton's initial success, the absolutely fatal miscalculations they made during the pandemic, and the mechanics of their current turnaround. So let's unpack all of this. Before we get into the wild pandemic numbers, we really need to look at the original foundation of Peleton. The founder, John Foley, well, he wasn't a fitness industry veteran. He didn't come from a big gym chain. He actually came from e-commerce. Specifically, he was an executive at Barnes & Noble, of all places, the American bookstore. A totally different world. His vision in 2012 was essentially to bring the kind of high-end boutique spin classes to the masses. He wanted to take that kind of intense, sweaty, exclusive studio energy that people were paying like, $35 a go for in New York and just beam it straight into your home. Now, it's a strong product vision, certainly. I mean, the appeal is obvious, but the execution is where things immediately started diverging from standard tech startup playbooks. Peleton decided immediately to vertically integrate almost everything. They owned the entire value chain. So they engineered the physical bikes, they wrote software, they produced the daily media content in their own studios. They ran physical retail showrooms. They even managed their own delivery fleet. I mean, it's insane. I get wanting to kind of control your quality, but why would a tech-focused founder take on the absolute nightmare of physical logistics? Delivering heavy metal bikes across the entire country, across the world, when there are established freight networks that already exist, it just kind of seems unnecessarily difficult. But we can actually interpret this decision through Porter's generic strategies. So in this model, a business generally has to choose a lane. Are you going to be the low-cost provider, or are you pursuing pure differentiation? Now, Peleton definitely was not cheap. Peleton showed aggressive differentiation. By owning the entire chain from the factory floor right down to the delivery van, they believed that they could guarantee a flawless premium customer experience. But that level of control comes with a massive cost structure. To support it, they had to charge premium prices. I mean, we were talking between £1,600 and £2,300 for the hardware alone, plus a monthly subscription fee on top of that. It's a staggering barrier to entry for the average person who just wants to do some cardio. You're being asked to drop £2,000 before you even break a sweat. Which is why we really have to look at the resource-based view to understand how they convinced people to actually pay it. Because a bike is really just a bike. Strategy theory argues that a firm's sustained competitive advantage comes from internal resources that are valuable, rare, and inimitable, or difficult for competitors to imitate. If you look closely, Peleton's core resource was never the physical bike itself, because anyone with a factory can weld a steel frame and attach some pedals. The rare, hard-to-copy resources were the digital platform they owned that they streamed their workouts on, the highly produced media, and crucially, their instructor talent. Peloton didn't treat their instructors like gig workers. They treated them like star athletes or like A-list celebrities, and people became obsessed with them. Some business analysts pointed out that this created what they called a cult-esque following. That's a direct quote. Peloton built this kind of defensive moat entirely out of emotional switching costs. Because if you as a customer decide to cancel a standard £20 a month gym membership, you just stop going. You might feel a little bit guilty at first, but your life doesn't fundamentally change. But if you leave the Peloton ecosystem, you're leaving the instructors that you feel like you know personally. You're leaving the leaderboard where your friends high five you every morning. The psychological pain of leaving is incredibly high. And that emotional lock-in is exactly what made their initial strategy viable, despite that astronomical price tag. They had a really tightly controlled premium ecosystem with really highly engaged users. And then the entire world shut down. The COVID-19 pandemic hit in early 2020, and the macroeconomic landscape just shifted literally overnight. And when you look at that macro environment through a pestle analysis, specifically the kind of political mandates that locked people inside, and the profound social isolation that followed, so that the P and the S in pestle, it was the perfect storm for digital fitness. We don't need to draw out a big formal diagram to see how those political and social forces aligned perfectly with what Peloton was offering. Traditional gyms were legally forced to close, and people were desperately seeking both physical outlets and also a bit of human connection. It was a captive audience of millions of people who suddenly had nowhere to go, no commute, and a lot of kind of lockdown anxiety and energy to burn off. And this external shock acted as a massive accelerant for their platform network. In platform economics, the service becomes more valuable to every individual user as the total number of users grow. So when tens of thousands of new people suddenly bought Pelotons, the live class was transformed from these niche little workouts into like massive shared cultural events like a concert. The leaderboards were packed, the social validation tightened, and the word of mouth marketing just became unstoppable. Now, the financial result of that was nothing short of historic. Wall Street went into an absolute frenzy. One analyst described it as a mass hallucination. And the valuation of Peloton skyrocketed to $50 billion. That means investors looked at this connected fitness company and decided it was more valuable than legacy automotive giants like Ford. But the critical failure here was how Peloton's executive team actually interpreted that valuation. They looked at these exploding sales figures and they concluded that they had engineered kind of a permanent structural shift in global consumer behaviour. They seriously seemed to believe that the pandemic lockdown lifestyle was going to be the new normal. People were never going to go back to physical gyms or offices, and they were just, locked in their houses. They were never going to be able to go and run in a park again. They mistook this kind of temporary shock for brilliant strategic positioning. They thought they were geniuses. They kind of believed their own hype. And because of that, management began making operational decisions that made their cost structure really rigid right at the time that they should have been remaining flexible. If we view this through Ansoff's matrix, they broke the cardinal rule of risk management. Because Ansoff's matrix is all about evaluating the risk of how a company tries to grow. Exploring whether you're pushing existing products or new ones into existing markets or new markets. The lowest risk move is market penetration, basically selling more of your current product to your current audience. And the highest risk move is diversification, where you're inventing entirely new products for entirely new markets. Well, during a period of unprecedented global uncertainty, Peloton tried to execute market penetration, market development, and operational diversification all at the same time. They basically mashed the accelerator pedal on every single avenue of growth while they were driving in the fog. Now, one of the most glaring examples of this was their acquisition of Precor, the commercial fitness equipment manufacturer. Peloton spent $420 million to acquire them, because they wanted to establish a manufacturing footprint to sell into hotels, university campuses, and commercial gyms. You know, those commercial gyms, the places that were literally closed. They were buying massive industrial capacity that they didn't organically need. And it was all funded by cheap capital because their stock price was artificially inflated. But there was a much deeper flaw than just, buying a factory at the wrong time. There seemed to be a total failure of scenario planning. They just assumed that the sales line that was spiking the pandemic would just keep on going up and up and up. The leadership team simply forgot that the total addressable market, that the number of people they could ever physically reach in the world, is inherently limited. One analyst phrases it brilliantly. They said, exercising is not like watching Game of Thrones. Now, that line kind of really stuck with me because watching a show is passive. Anyone can do it. Getting on a bike and sweating for 45 minutes requires intense discipline. Most people, given the choice, including me, would rather walk the dog or, eat a muffin. Peloton's executives assumed that their kind of hyper-engaged, pandemic-driven demographic represented the entire global population. And therefore, that kind of temporary spike that they saw in demand was actually, according to their projections, an infinite upward curve. Here's where things, I suppose, get really interesting. Imagine you're building an impenetrable, big, sprawling fortress because you're convinced that a winter siege is going to last forever. You hire an army to guard the walls, you stockpile years of supplies, you build new towers. But then the season changes, the sun comes out, the gates open, and everyone goes back outside to play. Peloton was basically left holding the mortgage on an enormous empty castle. Strategy dictates cost structure. Peloton's strategy of owning the entire value chain and preparing for infinite growth resulted in an absolute explosion of fixed costs. They signed long-term leases on huge warehouses. They bought manufacturing facilities. They hired thousands of logistics workers. Remember, fixed costs are immovable. They don't shrink just because your revenue stops growing. So by 2021, when the vaccines were rolling out, gyms were reopening and demand was clearly dropping, their chief executives, including the founder John Foley, were publicly out telling investors the pandemic was still a massive kind of tailwind for the business. Meanwhile, the physical reality behind the scenes was telling a completely different story. When analysts finally got a transparent look at the inventory data, they discovered that Peloton was sitting on 500 days worth of bike and tread inventory. Just think about the sheer physical space required to store 500 days of heavy exercise equipment. It's mind-boggling. And this is where we really have to transition into their post-pandemic reality check. If you apply Porter's 5 forces to the market, after the lockdowns ended, the competitive pressures had completely shifted because suddenly everyone could go outside again. During 2020, the threat of substitutes was virtually zero. By late 2021, substitutes were everywhere. You could go back to your local gym. You could join a recreational sports league. You could just run outside. They all became kind of highly attractive alternatives again. And the barriers to entry in digital fitness also started looking a lot lower to major tech players. That the threat of new entrants and competitive rivalry intensified dramatically after the pandemic. And Apple launched Apple Fitness, using the massive kind of Apple Watch ecosystem that lots of people already had. Lululemon bought Mirror to try and compete directly in that kind of living room space. Consumers suddenly had high-quality digital fitness alternatives that didn't require buying a £2,000 bike. So Peloton was facing plunging demand, fierce new competitors, and warehouses overflowing with unsold inventory. Because of those massive fixed costs that they'd taken on, it wasn't just a matter of making slightly less money, it was a structural crisis. Because when sales volume drops below the break-even point on that kind of heavy infrastructure, the margins just completely collapse. Every unsold bike sitting in a warehouse is actively draining your cash through storage fees. And as often happens when a company's core strategy falters, kind of secondary crises appeared and began to compound the damage. It became like this cascade of disasters. They suffered a PR nightmare with a safety recall on their Treadmill Plus product, and the handling of that recall severely damaged public trust. And then on top of that, they got hit with an intellectual property lawsuit from Lululemon over apparel designs. Now, all of this served as a massive distraction for a leadership team that was already drowning. They were bleeding cash at a completely unsustainable rate. So, faced with this kind of total implosion, the board had to execute a draft strategic pivot. The original strategy of vertical integration, kind of owning the whole process from manufacturing to delivery, was obviously broken. So they brought in a new CEO to stop the bleeding, a guy called Barry McCarthy. What's crucial to understand here is McCarthy's background. He wasn't from a hardware background or a fitness background. He wasn't a supply chain guru from a manufacturing giant. In actual fact, he previously served as the chief financial officer at Netflix and Spotify. He's a subscription software veteran. And that background dictated his entire approach to rescuing Peleton. McCarthy's actions are really a textbook demonstration of dynamic capabilities. This refers to a firm's ability to integrate, build, and reconfigure its internal and its external competencies to survive a rapidly changing environment. And the first phase of this was an aggressive retrenchment or reorganization, and it was severe. Peleton slashed 15% of their global corporate workforce to immediately save about $200 million in annual costs. But the strategic centerpiece of McCarthy's turnaround was actually ripping apart the foundations that John Foley had built. McCarthy reversed the value chain strategy entirely. He outsourced all the manufacturing to third-party partners. He decided Peleton was going to stop trying to run factories. They finally realized they didn't need to own the metal to own the customer. And that was kind of the pivotal realization there. It brings us back to the resource-based view, but applied correctly this time, because they'd figured out what their key actual resource was. They finally understood the physical bike was never their rare, inimitable asset. Anyone can produce a stationary bike. Their true defensible resource was the digital community and the streaming software. Now, the numbers are fascinating. If you ask the average person on the street what Peleton does, they'll tell you it's an exercise equipment company. But if you look at their revenue, they're actually a software app company masquerading as a bike manufacturer. The revenue split between hardware and software tells the real story of their current business model. So looking back a little while now, if we look at the first quarter of 2024, their hardware sales brought in around $180 million, but their digital subscriptions brought in $415 million. So the subscriptions now account for over 70% of their total revenue. And the margin difference between the two is the secret to their survival. The gross margin on their subscription revenue is an incredible 67.5%. Software economics are kind of beautiful because of no marginal costs. Once you pay the instructor and the camera crew to film a spin class, it costs the company virtually the same amount of money to stream that class to one person as it does to stream it to 2 million people. Selling heavy metal bikes was bleeding their cash reserves dry, but selling digital access to the community is a highly profitable, scalable engine. And that pivot from hardware reliance to software dominance is actually showing signs of working. They recently delivered a $70 million adjusted profit, which essentially kind of measures their operational abilities, and they generated positive free cash flow for the second consecutive quarter. They hadn't achieved that kind of financial stability since the peak of the pandemic hallucinations. It's a phenomenal effort, and it really proves that a highly engaged community, when it's embedded deeply into a digital product, can act as a kind of financial anchor for a business, even when the physical product sales fall completely flat. Basically, the software saved them. They've stopped chasing hardware growth at all costs, and instead they're defending those high-margin software subscriptions. If there's kind of one overall lesson from this case study, it's that business strategy isn't about being right once when, macroeconomic conditions are heavily in your favor. Anybody can look like a genius in a boom. True strategic success relies on dynamic capability. It's the willingness and the ability to kind of rip apart your own operating model and adapt it up when the environment inevitably turns against you. You have to be willing to admit when that winter siege is over. So we've seen how external shocks create illusions, how unchecked growth destroys value, and how kind of pivoting to software saved the company. But before we kind of wrap this episode up, I want to leave you with a final thought about where this all ends. We know that Peleton is now focused on their digital footprint. We've seen them announce partnerships with former rivals like Lululemon and even integrate with platforms like TikTok just to try and expand their software distribution without having to sell a physical bike. But given their kind of traumatic history with physical supply chains and the incredible high margin value of their subscriber base, what if their ultimate endgame isn't to remain an independent company? Could Peloton's final destiny actually be an acquisition? Think about it. Imagine if a massive ecosystem player like Apple or Amazon or a global fitness giant like Nike decided to absorb Peloton. If Peloton's true underlying value is the software in this kind of cult-esque community, maybe the future of Peloton isn't a standalone hardware company fighting for market share. Maybe its destiny is to become a premium integrated feature within a much larger global platform. Just something to think about. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Strategy Show. If you enjoyed it or you found it useful, or maybe both, please follow the podcast so you won't miss future episodes. And please feel free to drop me a comment on the episode. See you next time.